In this video, we will be exploring ICAM's Humane Dog Population Management Guidance, delving deeper into key concepts to help you understand and use its content more clearly. Today, we will be specifically looking at how we define different subpopulations of dogs, including roaming dogs. By explaining what we mean by these terms, precisely what sort of dog we are talking about, our guidance on how to manage them becomes easier to understand. So whose dog is this anyway? A number of different terms may be used to describe the same dog. Stray, street, feral, wild dog, free roaming, and roaming. For ICAM, the term roaming dog made the most sense, and this is what we use in our guidance documents. But why not any of the other terms? Well, our concern with some terms is that they have an implicit meaning, a meaning that may not be consistent across countries. For example, a stray dog in some countries is defined as an owned dog that has strayed away from its home and is currently lost. But in other countries, this means an unowned dog. A street dog implies that the dog has no other home but on the streets, so it also implies the dog is unowned. The word feral has a clear definition in biology. This is a domesticated animal that has reverted to a wild state and now lives independently of people. To be defined as truly feral, they should also be able to survive and breed successfully, therefore sustaining a population in the absence of support from people. According to this definition, feral dogs are a rare and unusual population, as domestic dogs living without resources provided by people have high mortality and very poor breeding success. Their numbers only maintained through constant immigration from other populations of dogs. And so we settled on the term roaming dogs. This is the same as the term free roaming, but we felt the word free wasn't necessary, and went for the shorter version of just roaming. This is the term for a dog that is seen on public property without the supervision of a person. Importantly, this is purely defined through observation of the dog's behaviour and makes no judgment on its ownership. We talk about this in more detail in Chapter 1 of our Dog Population Management Guide. This lack of ownership judgment is important. Often when people think of roaming dogs, their minds are usually focused on these guys, the unowned dogs. But when we see a dog on a street, it may actually be any one of these 4 different types of roaming dogs: unowned, owned but currently roaming free, owned but currently lost, and community owned. These are dogs that do not have a single referral household that claims ownership, but there may be several people that offer regular care, including food and sometimes shelter. Studies have shown that in many places, most dogs on the streets have an owner, but are allowed to roam unsupervised. Here I shall share some examples of studies that looked at the total dog population within specified geographical areas. These are areas where roaming dogs are visible on the streets. The following are estimates for the proportion of owned dogs. Importantly, this is looking at the total dog population, both those seen in households and on the streets. In Chad, 89 to 99% of the dogs were characterised as owned, dependent on which study zone they were looking at. In Iringa, Tanzania, they estimated over 99% of the dogs were owned, leaving just under 1% as unowned dogs. This was described by the study authors as surprisingly low, given that Aringa had been selected for the study because of its reported large unowned dog population, showing how easily owned roaming dogs can be misperceived as unowned. In South Africa, an in-depth longitudinal study of all dogs living in 2 communities revealed just 2 unowned dogs out of several hundred owned dogs. In Sri Lanka, 81% of the dogs were found to be owned. Whether the remaining 19% were community-owned or unowned was not explored. Whilst in Bali, a complete census of all dogs living in the sub-district of Sanur revealed 97% of these dogs were owned. So if these studies found that the vast majority of the dogs in these communities were owned and only a small percentage were unowned, how come we see so many roaming dogs on the streets of these same communities? Well, these studies and other similar studies have looked at confinement practices of owned dogs. Whilst confinement and supervised walks of owned dogs is the norm in much of Europe and Northern America, for many countries the norm is to allow your dog to roam for at least part of the day, perhaps to perform its role as a watchdog or guard dog, or to fulfill the dog's need for exercise, socialization and toileting, more similar to the way Europeans keep pet cats. And because the owned dog population can be quite large, it only takes a proportion of these dogs to be allowed to roam freely for the streets to start looking quite busy in terms of roaming dogs. A roaming dog population comprised of owned roaming and unowned, but also community dogs and owned dogs that have been lost. Here are some studies looking at what proportion of owned dogs are allowed to roam unsupervised by their owners. In rural communities in Mexico, 55% of owned dogs were allowed to roam all the time. In rural Chilean communities, this was 85%, falling to 51% in urban areas. Back to Tanzania, we see that 37% of those owned dogs were reported to be allowed to roam. And one of those South African communities, over 90% of the owned dogs were either never confined or only intermittently. In Kathmandu, a large urban area, 53% of owned dogs were reported by their owners to be free to roam all the time, whilst in 2 village communities of Bali, over 90% of the dogs were either never confined or only intermittently. But why do these distinctions of dog subpopulation matter? Well, to manage a dog population, in order to improve dog welfare and reduce risks that roaming dogs present to people, other animals and each other, we need to know all the different places these dogs come from. Because dog population management cannot deal only with the roaming dogs of today, that's the symptom of our dog management problem, we need to work on the root cause or the source of these dogs on the street. And those sources differ with the different subpopulations of roaming dogs. In Chapter 2, we introduce the concept of population dynamics, which describes the various subpopulations of dogs and the dynamic processes at play. There are several dynamic processes that act as sources of roaming dogs. We see breeding of unowned and community dogs. We also see the death of many of these puppies. And so the process of recruitment, where a puppy grows up and joins the adult breeding population, may be quite limited for these roaming dogs. We see owned dogs become lost. Some will be reunited with their owners, but if this reuniting fails, they will join the unowned dog population or community dog population, dependent on how quickly they are noticed by the local communities and offered some form of care. As we saw previously, many owned dogs will be allowed to roam unsupervised by their owners, returning home when needed and to access care provided by their owners. However, some dogs are abandoned, where they follow the same route as lost dogs, joining the unowned dog population or community-owned, dependent on the action of local people. This may be a particular risk where access to reproduction control is limited and there is a proliferation of unwanted births. So we can see there are different processes working as sources for these different subpopulations of roaming dogs, and many counter processes that take them back off the streets. And population management actions will need to be designed to address these different processes for different dogs. We should also recognise that whilst the risks roaming dogs present need to be mitigated and therefore reduced, the dogs themselves are not necessarily unwanted. These dogs have value to different people and to differing extents dependent on which subpopulation of dog they are. And it's for each community to dictate whether an actual reduction in roaming dogs is desired, and whether this differs for different subpopulations, or whether an improvement in welfare and reduction in disease risk is sufficient without a change in numbers. Chapter 2 provides more in-depth guidance on the methods you can use to explore dog population dynamics, to reveal the subpopulations of roaming dogs, the processes that work as sources, and also the drivers of those processes, not least human behaviour, what people are doing with dogs and the motivations behind those behaviours. We also note that the time and resources required to reveal all the details about dog population dynamics will be more than most of us can spend. And so we need to learn what we can with the resources we have available, and then commit to monitoring how these roaming dog populations are changing over time, so we can evaluate and learn more about their dynamics and what our interventions are doing to change those dynamics. There is more about this in our companion guide, Are We Making a Difference? A guide to monitoring and evaluation of dog population management interventions. I hope you found this explanation of roaming dog subpopulations useful. Please visit our ICAM website to download this dog population management guide, as well as many other ICAM resources for companion animal management. Thank you for listening.